get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say.
This is so awesome.
We are an open culture that believes in the importance of
What is that process that a developer, or let's say,
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed?
Welcome to another episode of In the Clouds. I am your host, Stu Miniman, and really excited for the discussion we are going to have today. Calendar has flipped yet again. It is now June 2022, and I'm happy to welcome to the program a first-time guest for this, but one that I've had many conversations over the years, Dr. Steve Herrod, who is the managing director at General Catalyst, a venture capitalist firm. Steve, pleasure to see you. Thanks so much for joining me.
That was a cool opening, Stu. Thanks. I'm excited to be here and chat with you about it.
Yeah, you and I, as I said, we talked many times on theCUBE. First met you when you were the CTO at VMware. For our audience that isn't aware, you were PhD. You got your PhD from Stanford, where, of course, lots of the Valley companies and especially VMware pulled their talent. You were CTO, and everyone in the VMware community knew you from. I happen to be a vExpert for a number of years, and you gave a lot of time and attention to them. You gave lots of keynotes and would bring, great knowledge and energy. Even played drums on stage one time, which if many of us is like, if we could only be as cool as Steve, dropping knowledge and doing some cool stuff up on stage. And then, gosh, it was hard for me to believe that already you've been a venture capitalist for 8 years. A lot of focus, open source, developers, security, and the like. So. Wow. Exciting stuff. So just maybe start with Steve, just, your job today, what you're doing and what's exciting you in the tech world.
Well, I'm having fun, Stu. It's just a great time. I mean, even in the current sort of messiness of what's going on in the market, it's really a fun time to be in technology. It has been my entire life. And really just trying to keep track of what are the big trends that are happening. What are some really interesting companies to start around that. And then the investment side sort of follows from that. Can you help create the next VMware or whatever it might be? So yeah, it's if you're a technophile, it continues to be kind of one of the funnest times to be around. And we can talk about it later, but obviously COVID has made it both more challenging and easier as well. I have my first investment in Germany, for instance, and I've never been there in person or met them in person. But it's been a great relationship. So yeah, it's a time of a lot of technology change, as always, and it's been a time of really a lot of people thinking that they can create great new companies and trying to be part of that. Yeah,
Steve, as I know one friend of mine once said, if you're a technologist, it should mean that you're an optimist about what technology can do to help the world, help the future. I know it was part of the mission that brought me to Red Hat is, the open unlocks the world's potential. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of global things going on. There's a lot of economic things going on, the pandemic. I want to put a pin in it because we're going to spend some time digging into those areas, but we can't hide the lead. Acquisition, M&A, something that you as a VC know quite a bit about. You've had some, good successful exits for some of the companies that you've been a board member and an investor on. But there was a little company that you and I both know that is potentially being acquired. So Easter egg, I've got a little bumper sticker. I remember back, 15 years ago, everybody had "I love VMware," stickers, buttons, and the like. And VMware, which has had a storied career, a big impact on both of our careers. You, of course, worked there for a lot of years. I've worked with VMware for 20 years. They were a 100-person company when I started working with them in 2002. One of my claim to fame, I was one of the first handful of people at EMC working with VMware. I trained EMC customer support on what that whole server virtualization stuff was. And it's one of those few times in my career where I was like, when the World Wide Web first came out and I was showing it to people and I'm like, no, this is really exciting. It's like, VMware is one of those that I'm like, we didn't have any idea how far it would go. I remember when Ed Bugnon showed me what vMotion was going to be when it came out.
Yeah.
So, those kind of things. But just to set the stage for our audience, a year after I started working with VMware, 2003, EMC bought VMware for the paltry $635 million. Many said that was ended up being the acquisition of the decade, if not the century, for the impact that it had on the IT universe. Fast forward to 2015, Dell swallowed up EMC, which included VMware, for $67 billion. And of course, Michael Dell, lots of things that happened in that environment. It was the crown jewel of that acquisition that he said. A little over, but it was about 6 months ago, Dell spun out VMware, finally an independent company for the first time since 2003. And what happens? So swoops in, there is an acquisition offer by Broadcom now for $61 billion, which would be the largest software acquisition in history. I think, at the time, $34 billion for Red Hat by IBM was the largest software acquisition. So, first disclaimer, Steve and I are not recommending, or giving advice on stocks. Too much on that, but Steve, first of all, your long history and connections, and I'm sure you still know many of the executives and people in the Palo Alto area. So, what was your take when you heard about it, and what's your thinking on it?
Boy, it's been, just the history, as you've talked about, has been pretty interesting. I think there'll be business books written about debt and leverage and how to do this sort of thing for years to come. So it's been pretty fascinating from a business standpoint. But it's certainly been whiplash as you go back and forth. I think at this point, we're sort of moving into the next generation of how the company's going to work. The deal's not done yet, obviously, for both regulation reasons, as well as I think you called it out too, Stu. They have a interesting sort of shop period where other companies could technically come in and try to.
It's a 40-day period, and we will see. There are a lot of blockers that would make that very difficult, and not sure how many companies have the interest or the funding to be able to make that happen. And Broadcom already has the approval of Michael Dell and Silver Lake, so that that was a big hurdle.
Totally agree. But we can talk as much about this sort of that side of things if you want. I do think just, having been there for a long time and have so many friends that are still there, and Raghu, who runs the company, is a good friend and a great technologist. I think the question always happens, like, what next? What will become of this, not only the products, but the community and all the partnerships? And I think that's really what everyone is holding their breath about. I think I got involved, obviously, from the very early days. It was a Stanford project led by Mendel Rosenblum and his wife, Diane, who are just two amazing people. And I was in Mendel's lab with Ed Bouillon and several other folks. Just since you're in the IBM sphere, it all started by reading history books about IBM and how they had started virtualization. And that's something cool you can do in grad school. You can
what's an IBM, Steve? We at Red Hat, don't pay too much. I'm just kidding. Please go ahead.
In the greater sphere, I'll call it. Anyway, the point was, like, it was a pretty obvious idea from the past that just had to be realized again in the future. And that was
no, I totally, absolutely. Anybody that understands the history is VMware didn't come up with the term virtual machine. There were virtual machines on the mainframe. And back when I was an analyst, every time new technologies came out, I would go talk to our CTO and say, okay, please give me the mainframe equivalent, when containerization, when, some of these pieces. I mean, heck, I remember back in the Paul Maritz days of VMware, he said, we're trying to build the software mainframe. And, the question is, with the Broadcom acquisition, will VMware become the mainframe of the software world in many ways, which means it can live a long time, but not exactly the cutting, bleeding edge of where things are going.
Yeah, a lot of people watching the stream might be like, what's a mainframe? But anyway, just like stepping all the way back, I do think throughout the history of VMware, there have been a couple of key things that have made it successful. And a lot of other companies share these traits, but VMware in particular brought up some neat ones. One is just this big and ongoing investment in continued innovation. And that's, hiring great people, putting a lot of money into it, having patience to have a lot of failed projects. We have a lot of really cool failed projects over the years. But I think if you don't have a few failed ones, some of the cool new stuff doesn't show up. And that's what's put them sort of not just virtualization, but developer tools, multi-cloud services, big networking business, big storage business. So I think that, I think whenever you get into a larger company, can you keep innovation going is the top question that always comes up, the people and the patients. And then the other is something that, I think actually Red Hat's done this very well too, but just this notion of being open and showing sort of neutrality, if you will, across vendors. This type of software literally fits between all the software on one side and all the hardware on the other side. And when you get, and this is something we had to be very careful with, as you remember, Stu, when EMC bought VMware, when Dell got quite involved. Certainly, you want to take advantage of access to hardware and making things very interesting, and that's maybe as a side topic could be very interesting from Broadcom. But if you don't have all the vendors getting great access to the software and running with it, it doesn't achieve the full purpose of virtualizing these layers. So there's a big TBD on how this works, but for me, those are two things that are really important to watch: the innovation and the neutrality across hardware vendors.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. The day that the rumor was announced, Pat Gelsinger happened to be on CNBC, and they asked him what he thought. And it was very telling. He was like, "I spent 8 years and poured my soul into it. VMware must innovate." And they're like, "So is it a good deal?" He's like, "Well, I don't know if Broadcom will continue the innovation." So that is, as you said, that's the big question. There's a chart that most people are quoting that if you look at, Broadcom is looking to really increase the profitability, which two of the biggest levers for increasing profitability are, do we cut R&D? Do we cut, the number of headcount that we have? And both of those could put a damper on some of the innovation that's happening there. So, yeah, I guess maybe bridge over to where this fits in cloud. It's interesting. So many times when an acquisition happens, it's like you read the headline and it's like, wait, blah blah, cloud, this and that, and you're like, yeah, I don't know, 5% of their business is cloud. Are they really that? What are they really buying it for? So it's interesting. I wrote an article when Red Hat was bought by IBM, and I was an analyst. I said, look, Red Hat could become the center of IBM's hybrid cloud strategy. That is the driver. That's where IBM's pulling it in. When I look at VMware and where they play in the cloud, obviously, they are agnostic, the Switzerland of the cloud for a lot of pieces. But where do you see VMware when you invest in a lot of companies or in the cloud environments? How does VMware fit in that ecosystem? And I feel like even like the VMworld show is being renamed, because it used to be it was VMworld's World. They were a center of the ecosystem, and it was an acknowledgement that VMware's not the center of the cloud. They have a piece of where they fit, but they were still trying to explore. VMware explores, their new show, where they fit in the overall discussion of the IT landscape.
Well, first I'll call out too. I mean, I know this is a Red Hat discussion, or certainly a sponsored area, but I actually think the strategies are very similar on the two companies, and there's certainly products that overlap and have a very similar vision of where the world should go. Yeah, the theory is, at the top level, VMware's job in life has been take a bunch of messy chaos stuff at the bottom and provide some sort of abstraction layer that makes it easier to manage, cheaper, more capital efficient. And whether that layer, originally hypervisors between the hardware and an operating system, if you just sort of squint a little bit, you can imagine a layer right above the different cloud services and trying to make those a little bit easier to tame and use. Certainly have done it around networking capabilities and around storage capabilities. So I think the core notion of a lot of infrastructure-y software is this abstraction layer and nailing it right and making life easier as a result. So that's where certainly their efforts have been for a long time, and I'm sure will continue to be. I think the question for a lot of companies has been, how far to the new world do you go versus making sure you're taking along companies that haven't been able to adopt and move there as quickly. And I think that's what whether it's, I don't know if hybrid cloud is still a cool name or not, but the notion of sort of, let's take your on-premises apps and figure out a way to help you cloudify them and get them out into the cloud. That'll be the core mission for a lot of companies for the next at least decade, if not more. You'll have the cool new kids that are born in the cloud and never have to do their own hardware, but most of the world has a lot of legitimate reasons for having things more at the edge or in a data center. And so I think that'll be where all these strategies are zigging and zagging to get there. And I think at the very top level, you look at some of the cool efforts from both companies, actually, just on cloud native applications. How are people building them? And like, they could care less about anything under the covers. And it'll go all the way down to much more specific things like, how do I abstract out the network?
Yep.
But it'll be all those layers, and people will fight for what's, I think, most profitable and most interesting along the way.
Yeah, so Steve, in general, I try to avoid the, ontological discussion of, what terms are better or not. But from a Red Hat standpoint, hybrid is the term we've been using for more than a decade. I did an ebook last year that I'll throw in the chat there, because if I look at my environment today, I have a lot of things.
Yep.
If I look out 2 to 5 years from now, I'll have more things. Is that hybrid? My applications are hybrid. My infrastructure is hybrid. My tools are hybrid. My skill sets are hybrid. So hybrid's a fine term. If you want to use multi-cloud instead, that's fine. Edge gets into the mix, and we can have so many pieces.
Yeah. I like the ebook though.
Yeah.
I'll make a plug for that as well. It's better than John Grisham. You should check it out.
Thank you. Definitely a page turner. You won't want to put it down until you're finished. Yeah. So Steve, you've spent a lot of your time, looking at the security model. And when I look at, I think about, in the early days of cloud, security was a blocker for moving the cloud. The cloud doesn't do it the way my enterprise wants to. The bank, will do things. We really felt that flipped a number of years ago, where security could actually be a driver to help make me more secure. Because as I always quote my friends in security, the best way you can be more secure is to be up to date on things. So if I've locked things down and I haven't made any updates in a couple of years, there's probably a lot of vulnerabilities there. Boy, when I came inside of Red Hat and get visibility into what happens in the Linux world to even more depth than I'd seen, there's a lot that goes on in all of these communities. And open source now is really the default development model in general, and from security. So maybe, I'd love your perspective as to, open source and security. What's their role in the world today? How do those go together? How do customers and startups see that whole dynamic?
Boy, that's a lot to sort of pull together. I think I will say, so first of all, I'll say as an investor, I've picked cybersecurity as a very key area to spend most of my time. I'm on, I think, 8 boards right now of cybersecurity companies. And that was for a lot of reasons. One, I mean, if anyone who's been in the industry has seen that it's not getting better, it's getting worse, that it's a harder job to protect things than ever before. There's more surfaces. There's you and I working from home instead of in a nightly controlled, moded environment. You have all these different things going on that have made it harder. I think just the constant news about the different types of attacks, especially right now during Ukraine and all the other conflicts that are out there, the awareness of attacks is more than ever, and it's become a board level priority to have a risk mitigation program. And then lastly, for me, what I really love is it is one of the most technology advanced areas that people are working on. By definition, you need to be ahead of the next guy. And so you just see some really innovative and really fast moving startups able to capitalize there. So from an investor standpoint, fast moving, easy to adopt, always has a budget priority. That's great stuff. But from how do we make our world advance? It is the impediment to so many things, to the complete digitalization of everything we do, to our personal. I don't know how many times you've been hacked. I'm a bit of a target. So I've personally kind of worried about identity theft and all these different things. So it just has such a grand, for software and for the area we're in, it has some of the biggest impacts at a geopolitical level. And that makes it just really interesting.
And is open source, how prevalent is open source in the world that you're living in then?
So I would say open source is certainly a help in a lot of the cases. I think you'll hear 2 good debates I'm sure you have over time, Stu. One is security through obscurity, and the other is security through transparency. I think transparency probably wins. Having more eyes on it that are looking at it and making sure that that nothing obvious is there, or making it easier for someone to patch should they find a problem. All those kind of well-discussed areas of open source, I think, matter a lot. But if you kind of take it to the next level, if you take cloud and open source, then you really get the foundation of every new company that's being started right now. It's actually why it's a lot cheaper and easier to start companies in the modern world, as you can take the work that's already out there and skip the first 10 to 12 months of just building kind of some core stuff. But what that means is that you then have so many pieces of our industry and of our ecosystem that are built on top of someone else's stuff. And I think that makes it a real risk. If there's a problem in your, I guess now we call it the supply chain, and that's kind of what it is. It's your software supply chain. If you find security issues in one package, like we have with I won't call out any of the most recent ones, but when there is a well-known and well-publicized security event, a substantial part of our economy can be actually in trouble with it. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think it offers more opportunities, but as more people use it and maybe have it built into their products and they don't have their own expertise, you really have to count on ways that others are going to be able to help you out, patch it, get it out in the systems. So it's a little scary what could happen with or without open source, with or without cloud.
Yeah, and one of the things I always found interesting is there's many segments of the IT landscape where the cloud providers have been eating away at the available market. You see some of the large cloud providers say, hey, if you have a great idea, why don't you even come build it with us, rather than creating a startup. Security, we know there's no silver bullet. If you look at the layers that need to go on, when I've talked to some really large companies, and like from a Red Hat standpoint, we will never say like, hey, our job is done. We've done all of the pieces. We think about security in everything we do. We've been pushed big on DevSecOps, shift left. We've made acquisitions in this space, but we're not saying like, hey, Red Hat, we're going to be your security piece. We have a large ecosystem, including many of the companies that you sit on the boards and have done investments on. So it's a complicated, messy, I hear your statement of like, hey, every year, are we more secure or less secure? And it sure hasn't felt like it's trending, better. So, and we've heard, how many times has it been, oh, do we need a whole reboot? What's going on? Or, it's been interesting, RSA conference is coming up real soon. And I watch every year, there's the RSA show, and then there's like the Amazon, reinforced security show. And the RSA show tends to have a little bit of a downer feel. It's like you're all hacked already, and we're already doomed. And the cloud security feels a little bit more optimistic. Any advice or guidance? Where do you look for companies that are helping to move us forward? And at the end of the day, trying to help change that overall equation of security.
Yeah, that's a great question, Stu. Let me talk about kind of four-ish areas for reason for optimism. I mean, certainly the overall thing about security in general, you're selling on fear or you're selling on risk, which is less fun than selling, here's how to increase your profits, and et cetera. So it naturally has a little bit more of that, but it is such an enabler and matters so much. Here's 4 or 5 things that I think are super interesting. So first of all, just the notion of the clouds, as you called out originally, I think what is fascinating is the security teams at the top cloud vendors are as good as anywhere in the world. And there's a lot of them. And the idea that you can concentrate such brains and people and software and tools in a cloud level and then have it apply to so many companies, no individual company could possibly have that level of security. So I think there is a notion of hardening something that's shared by a lot that's interesting. From a technology standpoint, I think some of the more interesting trends in security that I like are, one is, there is a real notion of, you might hear it called like AppSec Dev, DevSec Apps. You might hear these different things, but the notion is getting more security upstream into when developers are building their applications. We can talk a little bit about that, but I do think that'll be a very key thing to do and to get right. You can do better security the closer to the app. It applies whether you're deploying the app to different places. The other big movement that I think is really important is towards, you hear it called segmentation or isolation, and it sort of falls under a term you might hear called zero trust. But so long, our history of security has been, how do I keep something bad from ever getting in? And we've proven that the cat and the mouse game will, usually the mouse gets through at some point. So instead, I think what I really like is a lot of companies have now realized that might happen. Let's really focus on minimizing the impact when it does get through. And so there have been a lot of great companies and a lot of great technologies growing up around that. You might hear it talked to as the submarine analogy a little bit. You want to be able to close all those doors so that if a breach happens in the submarine, at least it doesn't flood the kitchen and everything else. So this notion of isolating off parts of your data center, parts of your apps, parts of your thing, I think is going to be a real key tool as we go forward in doing things. And then lastly, I do think one thing that we're seeing more and more of is increased ways of sharing, as good guys, sharing technologies, finding ways to warn each other about, hey, I'm also a Midwest bank. I just saw this attack. You need to turn on your firewall immediately. this notion of like, if you think of them as like a neighborhood watch for the internet, I do think will be more and more popular. And it's a good way to counteract what are very organized attackers, nation states, organized crime. So those are just a handful. There's a lot of others, but I think there's reason for optimism.
I love that, and that intersects with a lot of what we were talking about before from an open source standpoint. Communities of knowledge, being able to share some of those pieces, really, really important there. Good. I'm glad you've got optimism there. Actually, I have a question from the audience. Curious what emerging cloud technologies that you think will deliver the greatest innovation. So a nice broad, question. We can go outside of security. I know, you've had a strong focus, but you look at a lot of areas. So anything, you just had a child graduate from college. You're, recommending either, people looking for the next stage of their career or starting their career, something where you say like, hey, this would be, some really cool stuff that has some legs.
Yeah, no, these are great questions. I do think so. At the first level, I would say, not to push this too much, but cybersecurity will be the best employer for infinite time to come. It doesn't require necessarily an advanced CS degree so much as a real practitioner's knowledge there. Every day you see the report on how many jobs are available that we don't have people to fill. So cybersecurity, if you're that type of person, can be very good. What I think from the cloud technologies, I really like this question because I really see the world bifurcating a little bit into the infrastructure nerds and then the people who could care less and shouldn't care at all about anything under the covers. And so actually my favorite cloud technologies are the ones that just hide a ton of complexity and just start working. I still am very optimistic about the future of platforms as a service, and those have emerged in the titles quite a bit. But the fact that you can just go out and write a little bit of logic and have it infinitely scale, have it be secure, have it do all these things, for me, that's the most exciting thing. And it makes everyone else, I just say, far more efficient, and really getting hiding all the complexity is actually the most interesting technology for me.
Steve obviously was one of the things that brought me to Red Hat, is it felt that we had a strong position in that overall discussion that you were talking about, and my background's all on an infrastructure standpoint, and I say it every week is the only reason we have infrastructure is to run my apps, to understand what's happening with my data and all those pieces there. I spent lots of time in storage and networking, and that's kind of the plumbing and electrician type of stuff that the business shouldn't have to think about. It's that app modernization, the developers of things, the drivers of technology. So still huge growth in the SaaS marketplace, and what we're seeing. So it's interesting.
What's interesting about that too, Stu, just to call it out too, because I think what's cybersecurity, and come back to it, it is one of the most interesting things because it has an explicit trade-off between awareness or inconvenience and how effective it is in general. I think we always say like the strongest security is when you're not allowed on the internet, but that's not practical. So it's all about this dial on where you fit. So I think cyber is something that really you have to do dual factor authentication or something else that's just kind of annoying as part of that contract. I'd love to see all that disappear. And I think that is another way to think about where, when you're done, you never think about this again.
Yeah, I miss some of the earlier days in my career where security was, lock the door on the rack, and you were in pretty good shape. So you didn't need to worry about those kind of things there. We actually, of course, we got another question about the Broadcom-VMware piece, and I think ties into what we were saying. Is, do you think Broadcom will allow VMware to keep investing? It says here in microservice products, but any advice that you have for friends over in the VMware ecosystem, or working for VMware?
That's interesting. You could probably replace microservice with 15 other words too. That would be
Well, one of the questions we all look at and say, okay, like security, there's been a history of companies taking security, bundling it off, and and selling that off. So.
Yeah, I don't have any insider knowledge of what will or won't happen. I think you've read that there'll be a merger of Symantec, of the assets of CA, Symantec, and VMware under one brand. I think it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting technologies there. I've always thought VMware could be a very, very large cybersecurity company, for instance, and perhaps with those assets, they'll be able to marry things and use them very well. But yeah, I'd say in general, as you go to a bigger company, there's going to be less speculative investments and more things that are focused on relatively near-term profits. And so you can kind of take microservices and everything else and try to put it on that strategic versus tactical scale and sort of weigh them off. So I don't have any extra insight beyond that, but I think that'll be a lot of the discussions are just where do we focus our investments.
Yeah. So you mentioned, cybersecurity as a space that people might want to do. Any, what are the skill sets? I've been talking to some younger people, and used to be, learn how to code. Many people now in the cloud, it's like, hey, understand how to be an administrator. We've got, we need way more SREs and cloud admins and cloud architects out there. So any areas specifically that you think that some of the base underlying skills could really be used, and there's things we need to do as an industry as a whole to help make sure that the global market can participate. We can raise those skill sets. We've seen certain countries invest huge in certain technology areas that have led to certain growth. So we look at the current economic environment, and sometimes it's like, hey, what can we do now to invest to make that an opportunity so that things will look better? We can really boomerang out and gain some momentum.
Yeah, again, so zooming way out beyond just our sort of cloud and this sort of world, I do think what's been super fascinating amidst the COVID sort of relocation of people, and even before that, there was a fair amount of globalization of software. What's even in my own companies, the amount of geographical distribution across the world of people working on these projects is 10x what it ever was. And what excites me about that is that you're going to bring skill sets and knowledge to all these communities all around the world. And I do think that will speed up the notion of, hey, I actually care about this. Pick your favorite technology. I was trying to learn Solidity programming over COVID. This is how you write smart contracts for Ethereum. And there's people working all over the world and picking this stuff up. And I think it's just going to, when you look at your neighbor and you see them working on something, that'll get you interested in it. So at a very top level, I do think dispersion of technology and technologists is going to be really good for the global advancement. And I think that's really interesting. I think, again, if you look at, I don't know if anyone, I'm sure listeners have people applying for colleges. When I applied to school, getting into computer science, nobody wanted to do it. So it's pretty easy. Now it's like the top major at most schools, and they can't even have enough seats for it. So I think that traditional, like pretty academic approach to computer science is flourishing and will do well, but that still can't touch anywhere near the number of jobs around this that you need. So hands-on experience, I tend to look for people that are just curious and they want to know how things work. People who are, it's whether you're an SRE or whether you're in cybersecurity, if you are just like a dog with a bone and you keep wanting to know, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did that happen? That's the type of, I think, attitude and sort of carefulness that we'll need for a lot of these roles as well.
Yeah.
So take that background and you apply, some tools of the trade and really understanding how it works, and you're going to have a lot of great employees.
Yeah, right. And that intellectual curiosity is something that is so important, Steve. You look at your career and say, okay, how many distinct, kind of careers have you had? It's not just switching companies, but many people will switch completely what they're doing. And the next generation will have even more. So you mentioned, learning a language, doing Ethereum. I have to ask, what's your thoughts on the whole, call it Web3 or the metaverse, or, there's, maybe not the cryptocurrency side of things, but, there's a lot of those pieces for distributed architecture, some of which feel just to me like a continuation of things that we've been doing in the networking world for a long time. You think back about, okay, it's this Internet 3.0. It was supposed to be the semantic web, I thought, but what's your take on some of those things, which, might be outside of the cloud discussion, but definitely intersect with things?
Yeah, and especially in the venture world, it's sort of gone through the different levels of excitement and hype and whatever else. I tend to personally just avoid more the cryptocurrency piece of it. I think that's a use case for blockchain and for those sorts of things. But I do think, at a top level, it's like this is a distributed database with a lot of interesting properties to it, and as you said, people are reinventing a lot of what I feel like such an old timer sometimes too. I'm like, we already invented that. But like I had a kid talking to me the other day. He's like, so we're going to have like 5 or 6 layers on top of this, and this one will be for applications. Like, well, there's already a networking stack.
Steve, if you just tell them, the problem is always in layer 8 and 9. It's always the people in the politics, because the other 7 layers.
I had another kid say something like, "Hey, I think I'm going to build something in front of this particular blockchain that's going to balance the load." And I'm like, "You mean like a load balancer?" Like, so anyway, I do think there's a lot of recreation of whether it's identity, whether it's network stack stuff that just needs to get there. I will say that I am pretty fascinated by if you have total distributed database that has no one explicitly as the choke point, what can happen from that. And so I think it's very serious. I think if you look at where kids my own son's age, and if you just talk to people about what they're excited in their early 20s, this is where a lot of really smart people are spending their time. So it's messy, it's ugly, you can feel like an old man, and that makes it fascinating. So I'm spending a fair amount of time learning more about that and trying to get into the communities.
Yeah, so I'll take another question from the audience here. They said anything that you think is fading in the enterprise, and I'll give my my quick disclaimer is in IT I feel like nothing ever dies. Everything is always additive. It just how much time gets spent on it. You talk about CS majors. There's still a need for COBOL engineers. So those peak and valley, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually love Gartner's hype cycle, and if you see these charts that show what's new and what's sort of being sunset, I think that's interesting. Like without calling out specific ones, I just think sort of the things that are unstoppable at this point are, one is, you've talked about this a lot also, Stu, just the rise of developer choice and power is something there. I think the notion of, at least for a more advanced company, telling the developers what tool set, what platform, what everything they're going to use, I think that's faded very substantially. And I think the rise of the shift left power, as you called out as well, is just, it's going to be affecting every single part of infrastructure, from what cloud do we deploy to what tool chains, to what type of security is acceptable. So I'll turn it as another, maybe it's not what's fading, but I think anything that is anti-developer is going to have a lot of troubles as we continue to emerge into the new world. I think there are a lot of things that fall under that umbrella.
Okay. Well, we've covered a ton of grounds, Steve. Yeah, I mean, anything. Just to kind of want you to share as you look at your philosophy overall from an investment standpoint, where you're learning. Some final tips that you might have for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't pretend to be wise enough to offer a lot of tips, but I will say what it really resonated with me, what you said, Stu, the notion of what you learn now being even remotely relevant 10 years out is just not going to happen. So I think probably the most interesting thing I certainly have talked to everyone I can about is just find a love of learning, find a real curiosity. And whether it's doing a show like this and talking to interesting people, whether it's picking up a book and reading it, whether it's trying out Solidity. I'm a terrible programmer at this point, to be clear, but I want my brain to be kind of stretched and have some empathy for these things. So I just say career-wise, like, get into something, love it, work hard at it, and just know it's going to be pretty irrelevant a few years out, and keep getting ready for the next thing.
Yeah, the good news, Steve, is as we've said over and over, things do tend to repeat themselves. So, yeah, if you knew the OSI 7-layer stack and people start recreating it, maybe you go back and look at what we've done before, or go read the history books. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating that you say that Mendel and the team all were reading about IBM. My old boss Dave Vellante said that's how the external storage industry started too. They read what was happening with mainframe storage and decided to make something that would be open storage outside. So we all stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before us in the tech industry. Yeah, you mentioned in the greater ecosystem, there's that company IBM. They've done a lot over the last 100 years, and still adding to that ecosystem. So
no, I totally agree with it.
Awesome.
My other advice is to get out and see the new Top Gun. I just have to say that was, for at least people my age, that's about as cool as it gets.
Yeah, Maverick, I am planning to see it. I've heard a lot of things. The disclaimer I would say is, if you have not seen the original, just realize that it was set in the 80s. So certain things that were kind of more commonplace, and the dynamics between men and women and what was acceptable there is maybe not as proper in today's day and age, but yeah, we're trying to be overall, you know, a little bit more understanding. So it's good sometimes when you see the progress that we have made. I heard there's a couple of cameos that I'd be excited to see in the new movie. So yeah, it's awesome, and you know, things are opening up. Steve, yeah, are you getting to any like conferences, traveling, doing any of that sort of thing?
A little bit. I mean, think like everyone else, it sort of fits and starts. You do a little bit, then you find out 3 of your friends got COVID, then you pull back, and then you. So I think we're all kind of in this fits and starts part right now. I mean, RSA in many ways might be the COVID sandwich. It's certainly what kind of started it in the tech industry. So hopefully this is towards the end of it. But
Yeah.
I think kind of like everyone else, you're picking your own rough tolerance and what you want to be doing there. And mine's sort of somewhere in the middle, I'd say.
Yeah, no, Steve, absolutely. That was actually one of the earliest flags for me. Is I was talking. It was before I joined Red Hat, and I was talking to friends at Red Hat, and they're like, "Yeah, we're not allowed to go to RSA conference. We've been told there's too much risk for the COVID back in 2020." So that was, you know, the first show that I knew of that really everybody pulled out, and then Mobile World Congress and many others. I've been a couple of shows. So yeah, Steve, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Want to wish everybody, you know, please do stay safe out there. Hopefully you're getting connected, seeing some more people. Do please, you know, smash that like and subscribe button here on the video and our channel. We do run these every 2 weeks. If there is a topic or guest that you think would be great, you know, please do reach out to me. I'm super easy to find. I'm just at Stu on Twitter. I'm stu@redhat.com for email. And we'll be back, you know, in a couple of weeks with more topic here. You know, be watching, you know, what happens with the whole VMware Broadcom thing as that rolls out. You know, expect it'll take, you know, at least 6 months for that to really play. And Steve, thank you again so much. Thank you to the audience, and we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us on your journey in the clouds.